All right, I think it's time for a demo. Let's go ahead and create some EC2 instances using the Management Console. From the Management Console, we're going to click on Services, and under Compute, we're going to click on EC2. Once you're there, we're going to scroll a little bit down to under Create Instance. We're going to click on Launch Instance. And then here you have the option of selecting the Amazon Machine Image, or the AMI. This is the equivalent for those of you that come from the vSphere world, for example, to your VMX and your VHD files, if you're using Hyper-V or VMDK. This is essentially a prepackaged image that you can use to deploy and then customize from an operating system perspective. After it's been launched, or during launch, or after launch, you can include scripts, etc., to configure it. Now, there are pre-configured images that Amazon makes available to you, and there are tons of them. You can scroll down this list. It's infinite with different configurations. Or from the left here, you also have access to the AWS Marketplace. You've got community AMIs. The Marketplace will give you third party. For example, if let's say Citrix or F5 have appliances that they want to make available, you can acquire those from the Marketplace. Community AMIs, where others have maybe created AMIs that you can leverage for specific things. You can also have your own AMIs that you configure and upload, or that you save in here for repeated use. Now, for the purposes of our example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down here to the Microsoft Windows Server 2016 beta. I'm going to select that. And then from the drop-down menu here, or from the list here, you have the option of selecting the instance type. Now, during the lecture, we talked about the different instance types and how they are configured, whether it's compute, whether it's general purpose, memory optimized, depending on the workload that you are trying to create. This is where you would come to select the configuration that you're looking for. So, for example, if you're looking for a general purpose, for instance, in a T2 micro, you'll see here that the number, what the number of vCPUs is here. It's 1. You've got 1 gig of memory. It's an instance that has EBS for storage, and so on and so forth. If you scroll down this list, essentially, you can select the different type of instance family that you're looking for, and each of them will come with an associated price. So the higher that you go, the more that you're going to pay per hour for the use of this particular instance. Now, for the purpose of our example, I'm going to go ahead and choose the one that comes free here. So I'm going to select the T2 Micro, and then I'm going to go ahead and click on Next to configure it, to start configuring it. Now, from this menu here, from this screen, you have the option of choosing the number of instances that you wish to launch. You can launch more than one instance at a given time. For example, you can start by configuring only one instance. For our purposes, let's go ahead and say we wanted to launch 5 instances. So you'd put 5 in the text field here. And then if you were looking for spot instances, if this is something, for example, for high performance computing where you're requesting spot instances, you can select the checkbox here. We're not looking for spot instances, so I'm just going to keep that unchecked. You then have to select the network. Which VPC are you trying to put this in? Depending on the number of VPCs that you have in your drop down here, you can select it. I'm going to go ahead and drop this in the WBC VPC. From a subnet perspective, again, depending on the subnet that you want your instances to launch in, you would select that. For our purposes, let's just assume those are going to be app servers. So let's just select that. And then from a public IP address perspective, do you want to assign all of these instances elastic IP addresses or public IP addresses? If you select use subnet setting, then the default is disabled, which means these aren't going to get any kind of elastic IPs or public IPs. These are simply going to get the subnet IP address, a DHCP for an internal IP address. So I'm going to keep that for now. From the drop down, you can enable or disable that, or again use the subnet settings. If you had directory services configured using AWS, you have the option then of also automatically joining these instances to the domain. Now, at this point, you can also go through and create your directory services if you needed to do that. For our purposes, we're not going to do that. And from an identity and access management role perspective, if you wanted to apply a specific role or specific access to these instances, if you had that role pre-configured, then from the drop-down menu here, you can also add it. We don't have that at this point, or you can simply create one if you want to do it at this point. Now, the other thing that you'll be prompted for here is the shutdown behavior. So how do you want AWS to handle it when you're shutting down an instance from within the operating system? So when you go to, let's for example click Start Shutdown, how do you want AWS to handle that? Do you simply want the instance to go into a stopped mode, Or do you want the instance to be terminated? Now, the difference between stop and terminated, in a stop mode, you can always restart the instance. In a terminated mode, it's deleting it. Now, this is important here to make that differentiation, because if you put it in a stop mode, while you're not paying the hourly rate, remember, you're still paying for the storage that's associated with that particular instance. So if you terminate it, you're getting rid of the instance completely. So again, something to think about. In most cases, you're probably going to want to select stop as the default behavior, because that becomes a little less confusing, and then you can terminate the instance if you choose to do that. Now, the other option that you can also do, which is to enable termination protection. Now, a lot of times what we've heard from customers, what I've observed, is sometimes there's multiple administrators in the console and you accidentally delete an instance. In order to avoid accidental deletion, you can always select protect against accidental termination, which means if you try to go and right-click terminate the instance won't get terminated because it's being protected. You would have to remove the protection first and then delete the instance. It just gives you another stopgap to make sure that you don't accidentally delete instances that you didn't plan on deleting. If you wanted to monitor these instances using AWS CloudWatch, you can enable that and then start monitoring them through CloudWatch as well. From a tenancy perspective, you have the option of selecting either shared tenancy, which is the default, or you can go down from the drop-down menu here and select dedicated if that's what you're looking for. For our purposes, we're going to keep this at shared. Down here from a network interface perspective, how many virtual network interface cards essentially do you want to attach to this instance? For our purposes, we're going to leave it at default here. And we're also going to not assign the primary IP address. It's automatically going to be assigned. If you wanted to give it a specific one from the subnet, then you can click on add IP address and do that as well. From the advanced details down here, if you scroll down, then you have the option of inserting text or scripts or files. What happens here is during the provisioning of this particular instance, this file or this text, the script for instance, will be inserted so that during the provisioning it is configuring it to your liking. If you wanted to modify certain settings, maybe you wanted to call out the installation of a particular application, anything that you want to do at provisioning time, you can do that here. And if you're provisioning multiple instances, as is the case with us here, then this script or this file will be applied to all of the instances that are being provisioned. Once you're satisfied, we're going to go ahead and click on next. Here you have the option of then configuring your storage. If you wanted the storage to be more from a capacity perspective, you can do that. You wanted a different volume type. Right now it's general purpose SSD. If you wanted that to be provisioned IOPS or magnetic, you have the option. Provisioned IOPS allows you to specify the number of IOPS that you need. So if you have a workload that requires 3000 IOPS, for instance, and the general purpose is not satisfactory, you can go to provisioned IOPS and put in the IOPS that you need, and then that comes at a price. Magnetic obviously is the traditional hard drive that's going to be the slowest. For the purposes of our example, we're just going to stick with general purpose. You have the option here as well of unchecking the button that says delete on termination. If you are terminating an instance, sometimes you don't necessarily want to terminate the associated EBS volumes that come with it. Maybe because you want to attach these EBS volumes to another instance that you're bringing up. Maybe you want to save them because there's data on them that you still want to access, but you still want to get rid of the instance. So in order to separate the instance from the EBS at termination, you can uncheck this box if you choose to do so. For our purposes, we're going to keep everything at default, and then we're going to click on next. Here you have the option of tagging your instances, of giving each one of your instances a value, so a name. I'm going to keep this blank. Now, if you were provisioning one instance, you can come in here and give it a value. I want to show you in the management console how you can do that automatically or manually by giving each one of your instances a name. But you can also do that in here if you choose to do so by giving it one or adding more tags for other purposes. If you wanted to, for example, also include the department, the purpose of this server, maybe the data center that it's in, a whole slew of information that you can then run reports against at a later time, maybe for billing purposes, or maybe just for asset management, maybe for showback, chargeback, etc. You can include any number of configuration from a tags perspective. Tags are very important. I highly encourage you to use them wherever possible. Now, once you've created or once you're at this step of the process, you're prompted to configure a security group. Now, a security group is essentially a virtual firewall that is wrapped around this particular object. Now, everything in AWS is essentially an object of sorts, right? So in here, the instance is an object, and the security group is a virtual firewall that is being wrapped around it. So remember, now you have the operating system firewall. You've got the security group as a wrapper firewall around the instance. You also have your network access control list and different layers of security. Here, you're either choosing to create a new security group for these instances that we're creating, or you're choosing to use an existing security group. So depending on how many security groups you already have, you're either going to use an existing one, or you're going to do what I'm going to do, which is create a new security group. And in this security group, I'm allowing RDP access so that I can connect to this instance. I can later come back and modify the security group, give more or restrict more based on what I need. For the purposes of my example, I'm going to leave this at default, and I'm going to go ahead and click on launch. Now, at this stage, you are going to review the instances that you're launching. You just want to make sure that everything looks okay. All of the configurations are correct. You can go through each and every one of them. Once you are ready, you're going to go ahead and click on launch. Now, at this stage, you need to create or use an existing key pair. Now, a key pair is important because when you go to retrieve the password for your instances, in order to be able to connect to them via RDP, you're going to need a username and a password. That password needs to be encrypted. This is at this stage is where you go to create a key pair so that you can encrypt a lot of the configurations that you are working with. Now, I've already created a key pair here called WBC, and all I really need to do is to acknowledge that I have it. But for many of you, you probably haven't created this at this point. So what you want to do is from the drop-down menu here, you're going to go ahead and click on Create New Key Pair. And then you're going to give it a name. Now, the first one that I have was WBC, so I'm going to just call this one WBC1. And then I'm going to simply download this key pair. Now, you want to keep this somewhere that you can access so that when it's time to use it, you know where it is. And for my purposes, I'm going to store this on the desktop. I already have WBC, and now we have WBC1. So I'm going to store this on the desktop just so I know where to access it when I need it. You want to put this in a secure place. It's going to be very important when you go to, again, retrieve passwords. So now that we've created that, as you can see, it's very simple. We're going to go ahead and click Launch Instances. And voila. Now this is going to take a little bit of time, probably under a minute, but let's go through here to Services again. Let's go to EC2 Instances, and under Running Instances, let's go ahead and select it. And as you can see, you've got several instances that have already launched. Now it's going to take, again, like I said, about a minute for these instances to launch and be accessible. All right, now while these instances are being prepared, now as you can see here, the instance state is running. However, the status checks are initializing, so it's still being configured. We talked about tags earlier on and how you can manually give each one of these instances a more friendly name so that you can identify it. So you see how it launches here without a tag. It becomes very confusing for you to understand, well, what is this instance? You only have the instance ID. If you scroll down a little bit, and you'll see some of the other instances that we've created, we've given them a name, Web01, DB01. This makes it a lot easier to identify your assets, your objects within AWS. Otherwise, you're going to have, when you get your AWS bill at the end of the month, you're just going to have instance IDs and IDs for different assets, resources that you're using on AWS. It makes it harder to understand what they are and who is using them, and, well, who do you build them to? So in order to create a tag here manually after the fact, it's very simple. You can simply come in here under name and click in it. So you see this button or this pen here. You simply click in it. And for the purposes of our example, let's just call this Web02. And we're simply going to name all of them the same thing. So let's do Web03. This is going to be our web server farm. And then let's do Web04 and 5. Now, while an instance is initializing, you'll notice that you really can't access it. So for example, if you right-click down here and say, get Windows password, the Windows password is still not available. So we need to wait until this particular instance or set of instances is done initializing here so that we can request the password from the AWS system. All right, now once it's done initializing, in order for you to get the Windows password, it's very simple. You're going to right-click on any particular instance. You're going to click on Get Windows Password. And once you have or once you have the retrieve default Windows administrator password, it's very simple. You simply want to click on choose file and find the key pair that we created earlier. So we're going to go ahead and click on choose file, and I've placed both of my key pairs on my desktop. The one that we created is right here, so I'm going to go ahead and select it. And once that's pasted in there, we're going to go ahead and decrypt the Windows password. Now, you are then presented with the credentials. You're presented with the IP address to connect to this server. You're also presented with the username and the very long password that I would highly recommend that you copy all of this information onto a notepad if you don't plan on changing it to a friendlier password. Now, this long password is necessary if this particular instance is going to be exposed to the internet from an RDP perspective. If this instance is going to be subnet only, like behind the firewall, and you can only access it from internal resources, then you're probably going to apply some kind of a group policy, and you're going to have the standard administrator username and password that might be a little less lengthy, so to speak, so it makes it easier to launch. Now, once you have this information, again, you want to copy it, it's then very easy for you to launch this instance. So if you click on close here, you can simply right click on it again and launch this particular instance by clicking on connect. And there are two ways of doing this. You can, again, you have your private IP address, you've got your username, you can get the password here again. You can download the remote RDP file. Now remember, this particular instance cannot be accessed from the internet. You have to use a hop server. Why? Well, because we didn't assign any kind of a public IP address. It's sitting in the private subnet, so we can't access it from the internet. Even if I give it a public IP address, the way we've designed our VPC, you won't be able to access it. So this will have to go through a NAT. You'll need a hop server in order to get access to this. So if I download this particular RDP file to my computer that I'm using, I won't be able to access it. I will have to first RDP to the hop server, and then from that, connect to these servers. We've done this in a previous lesson when we showcased how NAT works. It's essentially the same process here as well. And that's really all there is to creating instances, one or multiple, like we did. Now, there are ways to interact with this instance, right? So from the actions menu, you can select it and you'll see access to this menu, or you can simply right-click a particular instance and you'll see you've got a slew of things that you can do. We already talked about connect. We already talked about get Windows password. You can launch more instances like this. So it will essentially replicate this and just launch more instances like it. From an instance state perspective, you can stop this instance, you can reboot this instance, you can terminate this instance, delete this instance if you choose to do so. Again, pretty self-explanatory there. From an instance settings perspective, you also have several things that you can do. You can add or edit tags. Remember, that's important. You can attach this particular instance to an auto-scaling group if you choose to do that. You can change the termination protection. Remember, during the provisioning process, we talked about if you have an instance that's currently protected from termination, then you won't be able to terminate it by simply coming up here and click on terminate. It won't allow you to do that because it is being protected. So you must first change the termination protection settings, which you do down here, before you can terminate a particular instance. You can view or change the user data. You can change the shutdown behavior. Again, during the provisioning process, we talked about the shutdown behavior and how you can, on shutdown, either stop the instance or terminate the instance. Again, if you wanted to modify that, you can come in here and do that as well. You can get the system log if you need to. And you can get an instance screenshot if you choose to do that as well. From an image perspective, if you like this particular instance, if you've configured it to your liking and you want to create an image out of it, this is where you can come and go through the process of creating an image. Under networking, you can come in here as well and have a bunch of things that you have access to. For instance, you can change the security group. You can attach more network interface cards if you choose to do that. You can change the source destination check. We did this during the NAT creation, if you recall. And you can also manage the IP addresses for this particular instance. Under CloudWatch monitoring, again, you can enable CloudWatch monitoring so that you're monitoring this image or this instance, and then you can also add or edit alarms. As you can see, all of this is pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty easy to interact with a particular instance. Now, when you select a particular instance down here, you're also going to get a slew of information. So if we erase this a little bit, from a description perspective, it's going to give you, again, the name, the family instance type, the IP address, the subnet, the VPC, etc. All of the information that you would expect. From a status checks here, If there's any status checks for it, you can access them from here, or it'll alert you on them from here as well. From a monitoring perspective, if you are monitoring this, again, if you've got any alerts, this is where you would find them under tags. If you wanted to see the tags, you wanted to add tags for this particular instance, this is where you would access them. And that's really it from an instances perspective. It's really straightforward and very easy to provision, and it's also very easy to manage.